Feelers. This is Truth Over Feelings here with Sharena. Hope you've been enjoying this whole series from episode 5. We've been connecting our thought life, our emotions, and providing a biblical perspective. John is going to give us some more stuff. Let's listen in now.
This is really random, so bear with me. I know I didn't send this to you in advance either. Since you specialize with like infidelity in relationships, like I think about my own like personal life, and like I'm like a product of divorce. Well, you know, divorce in my family. My parents were married, and there was, infidelity, and and I think like how that like impacts my like thoughts on relationships and my fears with that, and I can see like how that like kind of has had an impact on, like you said, like talking about the expectations and like really assessing those things and what I hope for in a marriage. Listen, the Lord hasn't told me yet that that's my my thing, and I'm praying for clarity for sure. So,
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't know exactly what my question is, but I guess it's more like what have you noticed when it comes to like making the connections of like the impact on like whether it's like patients who have been like recipients of infidelity, like from a parental perspective, and then it playing out in their marriage, and what that looks like for whatever partner that has said like experience like has been cheated on versus the people who cheated.
Yeah. So there isn't necessarily, I'm trying to figure out how to word this, because there isn't necessarily a perfect positive correlation between if one person had experienced infidelity or cheated on the other, that their kids are going to experience the exact same thing. There's no positive correlation, perfect positive correlation between those things. What I can say is that what it comes down to, and this is what I talk about with my couples all the time, comes down to unmet childhood needs. Because the reality is, time and time again, and this is true of most family dynamics, because the reality is we're human, we're broken, we're finite, and we live in a broken world where our ability to not just relate to God from a human to creator perspective, but from people to people is broken and dysfunctional. What oftentimes happens is whenever there's certain types of dysfunction or brokenness in how we relate to our mother and our father, that causes us to create defense mechanisms, coping mechanisms, to interpret our emotions, our feelings, and how to communicate that and relay that to others in a very specific type of way that's unique to each individual. And what happens is when you don't heal from brokenness and dysfunction and how you relate to others, that dysfunction follows you through a lifespan up until the present day. So what I am oftentimes doing with my patients is helping them revisit their childhood and their past to understand, okay, what went wrong here? How is this contributing to what you're experiencing here? Because part of what contributes to the loneliness, which I described earlier as a big factor for infidelity, is that partners don't know how to communicate. They don't know how to relate on an intimate or vulnerable level with their partner. They don't know a lot of different healthy relationship skills that are necessary for heightening the depth and intimacy and quality of their relationship time and time again. And I typically use this model. It's called emotionally focused therapy, but it essentially is all about helping people understand how unmet childhood needs contributes to who they are today and how they got to where they are today. And I typically use this model to help myself understand people in general. So you might have heard that like stereotypical weird funny joke about therapists where like somebody could talk to you for like 10 minutes and then a therapist could like totally understand everything that went down in your history and what happened to you. not to freak anybody out, but I can kind of do that. So like usually I'll talk to somebody for like 15 minutes and I could go, okay, your dad probably abandoned you when you were age 6. Not to that specificity, but there's something to be said about patterns, relationship patterns and imprints that are pressed on our hearts as a result of dysfunction and as a result of sin patterns that we go through in our past. And so I would say that's a bigger contributing factor than parents having cheated on one person or another. But there are these things, and I could talk to you more about this later too, and this could be another resource that I might present later on, but there are these things called love styles, and not love languages, but love styles. And a love style is a categorical, structured, systematic way to describe how and why you relate to people the way that you do. So there's 5 love styles. It's vacillator, controller, victim, avoider, and pleaser. It describes a lot of the dysfunction that people experience in relationships and what they go through, why people fight, why people get divorced, why infidelity happens, all these different things starting from childhood. And when you understand your love style, you then have a frame of reference for being able to understand, oh, wow, I relate to people in this type of way because of this. So for instance, there's a category called vacillator. Vacillators are people that have fantasized, idealized expectations and preconceived notions for how relationships should play out. And when they don't satisfy them the way that they want them to, they then emotionally retreat and withdraw from others. They're oftentimes characterized as people that are angry or frustrated or disappointed in life. And there are reasons for that. It goes back to childhood. But essentially, there are ways of looking back on our own history and our own life story to understand how and why we experience the level or the category or context of dysfunction that we presently are in the moment, the way that we are.
Is someone, this is fascinating to me. So is someone limited or to like just one style, like, or is there like, okay.
Not at all.
Okay, because I was thinking, like, as you were saying, and I was just like, I could see like how multiple things there, right? Yeah.
But essentially, a love style, or as we call it in psychology, like an attachment style, helps you understand how and why you relate to people the way that you do, and how you relate to God the way that you do. So sometimes we have to correct and restore and heal from the dysfunction that we experience in how we relate to God before we can experience some healing and restoration in how we relate to others. Because sometimes we impose expectations on others that can only be satisfied in the Lord, more specific.
Yeah, that is so true, John. Like that's for sure something that I've noticed, like when I was, I mean, it's a constant journey, but like in the process of like coming out of like my brokenness, and like in healing, coming into healing, like that for sure is something that the Lord has been like revealing to me and working on in me. And I think about like, so I have another question. I think about like, and as you brought up like brokenness and healing, and I remember kind of having this conversation with someone else. Oh, I think Joanna in the that last episode that came out at this point. And I think like at one point, like when you come out of this like brokenness, right? Then like things that happen again that may like trigger some like past emotions or trigger events, like how can one say that they have become whole? Can one say that they have become healed? These are questions, and if so, like what does it look like if like things, are you not necessarily healed and whole if you like have these hiccups, like you run into these situations and like
No, that's a great question. And I refrain from using the word whole at times, because using the word whole implies that there's this idealistic, perfect criteria or goal or place that we can and get and perfectly achieve or get to. The reality is we can experience healing from the pain that we've encountered in the past, but because we're human, because we're broken, because we're finite, because we're in progressive sanctification, becoming more and more like Christ, we're never going to perfectly achieve
Absolutely.
healthy relationship building with other people.
Mm-hmm.
We can accomplish significant progress, but there's no such thing as perfection on this side of heaven. But to kind of get at the heart of your question, I've seen a lot of people heal from and recover from brokenness, from trauma, from pain, from a variety of different things that they never ever believed that they would be even capable of, or even personally imagined that they'd be able to experience. That is very possible on this side of heaven. And I think people can experience genuine joy and satisfaction and peace in their relationships and recover and forgive and overcome things that have happened in the past. But wholeness or perfection in something is something that I'd say, yeah, that's probably not on this side of earth. We'll be in our perfect state, in our glorified bodily state after the resurrection and after all that.
Amen. Thank you. Okay. So lastly, as if COVID-19, wasn't a significant thing to deal with for all of us. And you've already kind of started like introducing a little bit, but these past like couple like months have been like emotionally taxing just due to the racial injustice issues, the conversation, the news about death and how things are just playing out legally and in a systemic way. Regarding Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd. And it has resurfaced a lot of tensions and hurts for Black people. And I think, just that stewing on top of like what's been happening with like prejudices and treatment of Asian and Asian Americans related to COVID-19 and assumptions and all of that. So there's just like a lot of heavy stuff going on. And it's impossible to really like articulate the emotions in one word. And you already were saying like how many things people are feeling. You talked about anger, you gave that example in relation to these things. So like, can you just share a little bit of like your personal thoughts about these things? I have more questions, but can you share your personal thoughts about these things?
Yeah. So I don't even know where to begin because that is everything that's going on right now is so loaded and emotionally overwhelming for so many different reasons. I think what it's caused for me is it has helped me reassess and reevaluate and identify the own prejudice that exists in my heart. And if we were to be honest, I think that as a society, there's a natural tendency of prejudice existing, racism existing on an individual level. We talk about it from a structural standpoint, from an institutionalized standpoint, but the reality is, I think a lot of different people carry different levels of prejudice. And I can't speak on behalf of a lot of people, but I know for me as an Asian American, like I was referencing or alluding to earlier, I grew up in a shame honor culture type of system. So there's a level of Confucian philosophy that's embedded into that cultural structure and dynamic, this idea that you can work hard and achieve whatever you set your mind to. And so even looking back on my childhood and my history, I have been very quick to judge and dismiss certain groups of people that are disadvantaged and automatically dismiss it in my mind as, well, they didn't work as hard as I did, so I deserve what I got. And I know that that is an inherently sinful way of thinking, an inaccurate and wrong way of thinking, because the reality is there is simply just subjective bias that puts certain people groups at a disadvantage in comparison to others. And I think that in order for us to be able to tackle racism and prejudice on a grander, larger scale, societal scale, we first have to be introspective and take the time to look at what biases exist within our own hearts from a cultural standpoint, from an individual standpoint, all these different things. Kind of what you were asking about and alluding to earlier, I think we were probably originally going to talk about this before everything happened with George Floyd because of COVID and the pandemic. Asian Americans, more specifically, and the racism that we've encountered as a result of the Chinese virus. And I'm sure a lot of people have heard about all these different things online and how Trump referenced COVID to be like the Chinese virus. I personally have experienced a lot of prejudice, and that's part of my own story and what I grew up with. So to be quite honest, I grew up in a neighborhood where it was predominantly populated with other minority groups, like just other minority groups, and there wasn't a heavy population of like whites in my community. And I experienced a lot of prejudice. People used to call me names. People used to make fun of how I look. People used to say all these mean, horrible, hateful things to me when I was like 4 and 5 in an elementary school. And what that did to me was it caused me to develop this perception that being Asian was something to be shameful of. And what I did in response to that as a defense mechanism or coping mechanism is I over-identified with the white culture. And I sort of repressed the fact that I was Asian growing up. My primary frame of reference for the Asian culture was a community of people that I encountered on a regular basis. I'm not going to go into specifics, but I think at the time growing up as a child, I perceived this predominant community that I was surrounded by because it was populated with people that were in a wealthier class than I was, that were privileged, that had certain resources available to them because they were wealthy. I perceived them to be prideful and arrogant, and that alone caused me to develop this prejudice against my own culture and towards the Chinese community. Of my head as a child, I was like, okay, well, Chinese people are arrogant, they're elitist, they think they're better than everybody, they're this, and this. And I developed that perception from the limited window of interactions that I had been exposed to. And so I say that because prejudice is something that I think we all kind of experience or encounter or have some level of identification with or interaction with through a lifespan. And I know for me, I've gone through my own journey of like racial identity exploration, and I've kind of gone back into my own history, my own family background, and I've recently picked up Mandarin, and I'm like learning how to read and write and speak in Mandarin and actually learning to embrace my own culture. But I know for a lot of people, the lack of awareness of their own history, their own background, generational patterns and trends that have perpetuated in their own family dynamics, that also plays a role in their limitation and their narrow vision in being able to see racism and prejudice as an institutionalized whole. Because sometimes we first have to look back at our own history, our own life history, our family history, generational patterns to first identify with ourselves, like, hey, how is this playing out in my life? Oh, okay, this is how it's impacting others. This is the perpetual trend that's happening over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Hey feelers, this was such a good episode in this part. We're going to have a little bit more next week, so stay tuned. And again, I really want to hear from you. And until then, like, comment,